The last two Godzilla movies saw Godzilla leave the dark side to become a good guy in the story. His Jedi adventure kind of continues in Ebirah, Horror of the Deep, also known as Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster. I think it's fairly well known that this was meant to be a Kong movie. The project broke down and Toho would end up making the absolutely bonkers King Kong Escapes. Godzilla was a last-minute replacement for the giant gorilla, and sometimes it shows. Anyway, the film wastes no time in getting to the island where the bulk of the movie is set. Ryota wants to sail to sea to find his lost brother after a chanting psychic assures him he's still alive. Strangely, no one else believes her, but Ryota needs a seaworthy vessel, and sadly, he's 3 days too late to enter an endurance dance competition, where the winner will take home a new boat. He ends up commandeering a sailboat after he and some new friends end up spending the night in one. They, along with an infamous thief, end up shipwrecked, and the rest of the film is spent trying to escape the island and the evil Red Bamboo organization who are making a nuclear bomb there. The waters surrounding the island are home to Ebirah, a giant lobster crab prawn thing. Ebirah is often overlooked as one of the great kaiju beasts, which I feel is unfair. The name Ebirah comes from the Japanese word for shrimp, ebi, resulting in Ebirah often mockingly being called Shrimp-Zilla. There are only so many man-in-a-suit or flying designs you can come up with before they start to look a bit samey, so I think Ebirah is a magnificent beast who looks like nothing we've had before. His huge claw is menacing, and his smaller claw is used for stabbing things. His exterior is incredibly detailed, with various lumps and bumps, and he even has plant life growing on him. I think it's a superb design, and the red coloration really stands out compared to what we've seen before. It's a unique monster, it moves differently, and even has articulating eyes. There's something more believable about this giant sea monster because it's somewhat based on reality, like a giant squid or a mega shark, rather than, say, a chicken with a circular saw. Godzilla in this film looks pretty good, but it's not the best suit. It's basically the same costume from Invasion of Astro Monster, which was a fairly slimline suit allowing for more movement. It has nicely defined dorsal spines and a fairly expressive face with moving eyes. Interestingly, the head of the suit was borrowed by A.G. Tsuburaya and grafted onto the beautiful Godzilla suit from 1964's Mothra vs. Godzilla to create the monster Jiras in the Ultraman TV series. But if you see it, it's clearly Godzilla with a neck frill. Anyway, this led to a replacement head being cast from the original, but it wasn't quite of the same quality. So in some scenes, Godzilla's facial features are slightly different, and the eyes look a little wonky. Godzilla isn't the fearsome monster he once was. In fact, the heroes of this film deliberately activate Godzilla, and they do it by building a conductor to wake him up with an electrical jolt. It's a bit of a long shot, to be honest. They don't know if the bolt of lightning will wake Godzilla up, or even if there'll be a lightning storm anytime soon. But then again, what do I know? This was actually one of my favourite Godzilla moments as a kid, hearing his heartbeat and then seeing his eye open. I thought it was so cool. Godzilla is definitely more human-like now with his mannerisms. We see him sleeping, we see him rubbing his nose, we see him irritated, playful, and we see him sleeping again. The switching out of Kong for Godzilla seems obvious in some parts of the film. A scene where Godzilla seems entranced by a human woman is clearly a Kong-type moment, which I suspect was simply left in the script and mirrors typical King Kong behaviour from other films, where Kong becomes fascinated with a human female and doesn't harm her. Also, if you recall in King Kong vs. Godzilla, Kong is powered up, or at least revived, by electricity, and that's basically what happens here. You can really see how Godzilla's role in the film was originally intended for Kong. The scene where Godzilla falls asleep after watching Dio the tribeswoman really makes no sense, but you can imagine that the original intention would have been for Kong to have maybe picked her up, with her then waiting for him to fall asleep so she can escape. There's a couple more kaiju in this film too. A giant condor, which is clearly Rodan with some feathers stuck to it, looks surprisingly alright, but the fight is a little pointless, and it seems more like an irritation to Godzilla rather than a genuine foe. Godzilla ends up roasting it with his breath like a Christmas turkey. And of course, there's Mothra. Central to this film is the enslavement of the tribespeople of Infant Island, Mothra's home. They are held captive and forced to make a yellow liquid which repels Ebirah. I love Mothra, and she looks okay here, but she's definitely seen better days. Also, I can't help but think that seeing as she is psychically linked to the people of Infant Island, that she could have done more to rescue them ages ago. It's 1966, and by this point, the market for kaiju movies had changed. Several studios were making cheap suitmation movies, and Eiji Tsuburaya, the so-called father of tokusatsu, had launched his own TV series under his own Tsuburaya Productions label. Ultra Q was a success, but nowhere near as successful as his Ultraman series, which became one of the biggest franchises in Japanese pop culture history, bigger even than Godzilla. Tsuburaya diverted much of his time to his new Ultraman project, and he was unable to dedicate time to this Ebirah movie, so Sadamasa Arikawa instead worked on the special effects. In fact, Eiji Tsuburaya's biggest impact on this film was probably when he took Godzilla's head to use in his own project. This was a low-budget film, and Toho Studios were more focused on their War of the Gargantuas movie, which utilized the talents of usual Godzilla director virtuoso Ishiro Honda. It was the absence of top talent like Honda and Tsuburaya which led to American production studio Rankin Bass disallowing the use of King Kong in this film. The drop in quality can be felt in the film, but it's not always clear why. The visual effects aren't bad, they're just not as great as what we've been used to. Miniatures are good, but not quite as detailed. Although the use of moving people in the model rafts is actually pretty amazing, and quick cuts between models and live action are incredibly effective. The jump between the two isn't really noticeable, and it also means you don't get too much time to scrutinize the quality of what you're seeing. Like I say, it's not bad, it's just not quite to the level we've come to expect. But it does work, and the scene, for example, where the mast snaps looks really good. The military-style base initially looks great when we see Godzilla approach it, but from a different angle, it looks a bit sparse. However, the inside of the base looks fantastic, with lots of bright-coloured ducting and flashing lights. It's a superb set. The simplicity of it means that the miniatures work well when it starts to collapse. Another piece of top talent absent from this film was Akira Ifukube. Instead of his bombastic military marches, we get a jazzy, light-hearted 60s score. Ifukube's music is such a big part of Godzilla, and in fact the wider Toho monsterverse, that its absence feels significant. The score in this film has a generic 60s feel. It almost feels like a pastiche of James Bond and Batman themes, which sometimes doesn't feel in keeping with the mood. A fairly dramatic moment may be accompanied by a cartoony soundtrack. At times when you watch this, it's hard to believe that only 12 years have passed since this and the original 1954 Gojira. The change from post-war brooding to 1960s grooviness is pretty amazing to observe. The film actually has a really nice look to it. The 60s film stock is gorgeous, and unlike the desaturated colours and wafer-thin depth of field, which is fashionable at the moment, Ebirah has that Technicolor 60s look, with bright reds and yellows which pop. The film has a lot of visual interest, and even the vegetation looks sumptuous. Instead of a dusty, sandy island, we get a beautiful location which almost feels like a character in the film. This doesn't look like an ultra-low-budget film. Jun Fukuda famously hates the Godzilla films he directed, but he's got nothing to be ashamed of here. This is a competently shot film which maintains a decent pace and makes the most of what it has. Fukuda was a fan of James Bond, which was massive in 60s Japan. In fact, Japan produced some Bond-esque type movies at the time, and it was Jun Fukuda who directed the Toho Japanese spy thriller 100 Shot, 100 Killed, known outside of Japan as Iron Finger. And guess who starred in it? Yes, Akira Takarada and Akihiko Hirata. And a year after this film, Toho provided actors, production crew and facilities to Eon Productions for filming of You Only Live Twice. Anyway, back to Ebirah, Horror of the Deep. The studio told Fukuda to keep compositing to a minimum because it was so expensive. The compositing we do see is effective, but I feel it can look a bit fake anyway, so the film doesn't really suffer from a reduction of it. The scenes of Mothra being worshipped look great. It's clearly a painting, but the shot looks really well formed. Top production talent from previous Godzilla films might be absent, but much of the acting talent is familiar. Akira Takarada, Kumi Mizuno, Jun Tazaki, and Akihiko Hirata are some of the many familiar faces from previous Godzilla movies. Hirata even has an eye patch again in this film. The main problem with this film is that it doesn't need the monsters. Take the kaiju out and this would be a decent 60s action film where a group of people foil an evil organisation and have to escape the island. This has the look and sound of a 60s spy comedy. Our heroes creep around the base of a secret evil organisation, which has a secret laboratory, henchmen, and a caricature villain. They hide in corridors, they pick locks, and the film has comedy moments like when they hide behind a bush and move it to get closer to the base. The kaiju do add to it, but everything they bring in terms of narrative could be achieved easily in other ways. The group are trapped on the island because of Ebirah, but the film establishes that the island has gun turrets and hidden microphones, so even without a giant sea monster, they could still be trapped. Maybe the original Kong concept would have utilised the monster mayhem a bit better. The fight scenes in the film are interesting, but not classics. When Godzilla is attacked by aeroplanes, or for our American cousins, airplanes, they look cool, but they just cause a bit of irritation to Godzilla. They don't do him any damage. He even catches one, it explodes, and he throws away the debris like a piece of litter. Or for our American cousins, garbage. There are two fight scenes between Godzilla and Ebirah. In the first one, Godzilla wastes no time in getting to action after being woken up. He's straight into battle mode, and we get a beautiful shot from behind Ebirah before seeing some rock throwing and catching, even a bit of volleyball and heading the rock. The fighting is a bit lackluster. At one point, Ebirah simply splashes Godzilla. It's such a rubbish attack move. We do get some hand-to-claw combat though, but the fighting is quite short-lived. The second fight scene is more interesting. We see some underwater fight, which is different to what we usually see, and Godzilla even does a celebratory clap using Ebirah's severed claw. An interesting point to note that there's a moment where you can clearly see Haruo Nakajima's face through the Godzilla suit. I think Toho need to invest in some waterproof grey face paint. Just to show how Godzilla really has ceased to become a terrifying monster, we are left feeling sorry for the big soppy beast, as are the characters in the film who are actively rooting for him and cheering him on. This might be a fun film, but it does end with an anti-nuclear sentiment, as it's noted that this may be the end of the island, but it's not the end of nuclear warheads. The film eventually concludes with an animated shot of Mothra flying away, although the net containing the people she rescued seems to have gone missing. I hope she didn't drop them in the sea. Anyway, that's Ebirah, Horror of the Deep. The inclusion of Ebirah, Mothra, and of course Godzilla should have made this a memorable Godzilla film, but it just doesn't manage that. The film is not actually that bonkers compared to the last couple of films. It succeeds in being an entertaining watch, but it never really commits to being a monster film. The monsters are a big part of the film, but take them away and it wouldn't take much amending to make this a kaiju-free, island-based espionage romp, where an evil slave-driving nuclear bomb-making organization finds a ragtag team taking them on to thwart their dastardly plans and finally piss on their chips. Or for our American cousins, French fries.